Welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and you might have the wrong card in your commander deck. I was actually going to integrate this into my Magic Rules series. I actually got the idea initially from someone that commented on one of my rules video about Menthara and Conjurer's Closet, talking about the rules interaction there, and so I made a short about it, and in the comments of that short, I had a whole bunch of people commenting about other interactions that didn't work, so I thought I would make a whole video about some interactions that don't work with certain commanders. So if you have a commander with that deck, the card you're thinking might work might not actually work. So Menthara and Conjurer's Closet, for example, both have an at the beginning of end step trigger, right? Your commander says at the beginning of your end step, if a permanent you controlled left the battlefield this turn, you get an experience counter, and Conjurer's Closet lets you blink one of your creatures at the beginning of your end step, which of course means that a permanent you controlled is going to be leaving the battlefield. The problem with this interaction though is your commander has a conditional trigger if a permanent you controlled left the battlefield this turn. If you ever have a commander or any card that has that if statement in the triggered ability, whether it be at the beginning of your upkeep, if something happened, it's not actually going to trigger, so it's not going to go on the stack if that condition has not been met. So for example, if you have a Felidar Sovereign, and again, this is going to feel a little bit like a Magic Rules video because that sort of is what I'm going into to help explain why these cards don't necessarily work. So Felidar Sovereign says at the beginning of your upkeep, if you have 40 or more life, you win the game. So at the beginning of your upkeep on your turn, if you have 38 life, this isn't going to trigger at all because you're not meeting the condition, right? It's not going to go on the stack. So anyone thinking, okay, well, at the beginning of my upkeep, I can wait till this ability goes on the stack and then instant speed gain a couple of life and then I win the game. That does not work. If you don't have 40 life at the beginning of your upkeep, this will not even trigger, so you won't have any opportunity to respond to it. Furthermore, it also has to meet the condition upon resolution as well. So if you do have the 40 life at the beginning of your upkeep, this will trigger, it will go on the stack, and then in response, if your opponent lightning bolts you in the face, you now have 37 life. When it goes to resolve, you no longer have 40 life, you're not meeting that condition, you will not win the game, right? So you have to meet the condition to trigger the ability and then also upon resolution in order to get the effect. Going back to Menthara, at the beginning of your end step, if nothing has left the battlefield this turn, you will not get this trigger. It won't even go on the stack. Your Conjurer's Closet, of course, will because there's no condition there. It just goes on the stack every single turn on your end step. So if you're thinking, okay, well, on my end step, I will blink one of my creatures like my commander or any other creature, and then I will meet the condition of Menthara. Too late, the at the beginning of your end step trigger has already happened. So there's no way for you to get that ability off of your commander. So Conjurer's Closet doesn't work in that specific interaction. I know you could possibly put a Conjurer's Closet in your Menthara deck for other reasons. Maybe you have lots of blinking creatures, but at no point will Conjurer's Closet work with your commander's ability. If you're blinking another creature, it still does not work with your commander's ability. It might work in the deck overall, but it doesn't work with what your commander is doing. Let's talk about Lalia the Blade Reforged, another commander that I got a suggestion from someone in the comments. I didn't know that people were doing this, but someone pointed it out, so I will clarify some things that do not work with your commander. Lalia says at the bottom there, whenever one or more cards are put into exile from your library and or your graveyard, put a +1/+1 counter on Lalia. So the important part of the wording of that ability is that the card has to go from your library or graveyard into exile. It has to go directly there. Do not pass go, do not collect $200, right? You can't make stops somewhere else. It has to go directly from your graveyard into exile. Now, the problem with this is anything you are casting does not work here. As I've stated again in some of my prior Magic Rules videos, whenever you cast anything, it has to go on the stack. Any spell that is cast has to go on the stack before it resolves. So if you are casting anything from your graveyard, it goes from your graveyard onto the stack and then it resolves and goes wherever it normally would go. So Flashback does not work with Lalia. And again, on EDH Rec, there's a whole bunch of Flashback cards that I'm seeing here that might not work with your Lalia. Maybe there's something else you're doing, that's fine. I see Ignite the Future here, that's in quite a few decks. That has Flashback, but it's also exiling top cards of your library, so that's probably what you're using it for. The Flashback part doesn't work with your commander's ability, even though it is exiling cards from the top of your library, so that part works. There is a lot of other Flashback cards on here that probably do not work with your commander. What Flashback says is you may cast this card from your graveyard for its Flashback cost, then exile it. So I think a lot of people are assuming what happens here is I'm going to cast it from my graveyard, it's going to go directly into exile when I cast it. No, it goes to the stack first. So you will not get a trigger off of your commander with a Flashback spell because it goes from graveyard to stack, then to exile upon resolution. And your commander is looking for a card to go directly into exile from the graveyard without making any stops in between, right? So just be careful there. If you're actually casting something from your graveyard, it has to go to the stack first. Similarly, the same thing applies to Chainer, Nightmare, Adept. Now, Chainer says discard a card, you may cast a creature spell from your graveyard this turn. So again, we're actually casting it. This is not a recursion effect, right? An actual recursion effect like Reanimate is going to take that creature and put it directly from your graveyard onto the battlefield. With Chainer's ability, you are casting that creature, so of course it's going from graveyard onto the stack and then onto the battlefield. So it's not going directly from the graveyard to the battlefield. Now, why is this important? Well, because a whole lot of people have Flayer of the Hatebound in their Chainer decks. In fact, 39% of Chainer decks have Flayer of the Hatebound in them on EDH Rec. And again, maybe there's some other interactions here, but as far as Flayer of the Hatebound and your commander go, this interaction doesn't work. Flayer of the Hatebound says, whenever Flayer of the Hatebound or another creature enters the battlefield from your graveyard, that creature deals damage equal to its power to any target. Great ability if you have creatures coming out of your graveyard, but doesn't work with Chainer because you are casting that creature. Again, if you have some other way of getting your creature out of your graveyard, maybe you're just reanimating whatever, that's fine. But with specifically your commander's ability, when you cast a creature from your graveyard, it's going to the stack and then the battlefield. So your Flayer of the Hatebound will not trigger. And I imagine there's a lot of people out there that probably think that it does. So that card probably doesn't work in your deck. I mean, maybe it does, but likely it doesn't. Let's move on to a very new, a very interesting interaction, Magar of the Magic Strings. And again, this is another question I had actually in my Magic Rules videos comments, and I thought I would cover it in this video from Adept Mage. What if you use Saw in Half on one of the face down creatures that you make with Magar? And that was an interesting question, really interesting one. I was scratching my head thinking about it for a while, and then I realized, well, it doesn't actually work at all. And sure enough, on EDH Rec, 27% of all Magar decks have Saw in Half in them, and this card does not work really at all in your deck. Again, if you're doing something else with it, maybe it works. I don't think you're ever going to want to Saw in Half your opponent's creatures. That doesn't seem like a great play. Obviously, you can get Saw in Half out of your graveyard with Magar's ability, but what are you going to be using it on? Do you have other creatures you want to be using it on? You probably are wanting to use it on the 3/3 creatures that you are making with Magar. That interaction doesn't work. Again, I'm talking specifically about the interaction between Saw in Half and your commander's ability. So let's look at Magar's ability. Pay 1 black and a red. Note the name of target instant or sorcery card in your graveyard and put it onto the battlefield face down. It's a 3/3 creature with, whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, you may create a copy of the card with the noted name. You may cast the copy without paying its mana cost. And what I think people are thinking is going to happen here, and I imagine the question I got is exactly that, is I have the 3/3 creature. It is a face down copy of some other spell. Let's say it's Rise of the Dark Realms, right? So I have a face down Rise of the Dark Realms. I want to saw it in half so that I can make 2 copies, and I now have 2 smaller creatures that are both Rise of the Dark Realms that I can cast with, something to that effect. None of that really works, okay? Now there's a lot of weird rule interactions here. Some of them I'm actually not 100% about. The one that I am 100% about is the fact that Saw in a Half just doesn't work with those 3/3 face down creatures at all. And the reason why is because the last wording on your commander says, if this creature would leave the battlefield, exile it instead of putting it anywhere else. And of course, as I talked about in my Magic Rules video about replacement effects, this is a replacement effect. So what originally would happen when you kill a creature isn't going to happen. Instead, it's going to get exiled. That effect is completely replaced. And if we look at Saw in Half, what it says is destroy target creature if that creature dies this way. Its controller creates 2 token copies. And that creature is not dying, right? In fact, Saw in Half is completely shut off by any of these exile instead effects, right? If my opponent has a Leyline of the Void in play, that exiles anything instead of it going to the graveyard, so it's going to undo any dice triggers, which your Saw in Half is looking for, right? Your Saw in Half is looking for that creature that you're destroying to die. If the creature doesn't actually die, it doesn't do anything, right? So if I have an indestructible creature, right, I want to Saw it in half. If the creature dies this way, well, it's not going to die, of course, because it's indestructible and destroy effects aren't going to kill it. So the rest of the spell isn't going to do anything because the creature hasn't actually died. And the exact same thing applies if the creature is put into exile instead of dying, right? There is a direct translation for dies. It means put into the graveyard from the battlefield, right? They used to write that whole phrase out on a card, put from the battlefield into the graveyard. That whole phrase has been shrunk down to just dies. That word specifically means that phrase. So if your creature doesn't actually hit the graveyard, then you're not going to get any dice triggers and you're not going to get the effect off of your Saw in Half. And of course, your Magar is saying that creature isn't going to hit the graveyard, right? Those 3/3 creatures that he's making are not ever going to hit the graveyard. There is no way that those 3/3 creatures can ever possibly hit the graveyard. They will always get exiled instead. So there is literally no interaction here at all between these cards other than you're just destroying your own creature, which then gets exiled. I don't know if there's any other interaction people are looking for here, but I imagine the interaction they were hoping for was, I'm going to destroy my 3/3 creature and make 2 copies of it. That doesn't work. It doesn't do anything. You will not get 2 token copies. In fact, you won't even get 1. The original one is just destroyed. There's very important wording there where it says, if that creature dies this way, you get the token copies. If it doesn't die that way, you don't get anything. All you get is the destroy effect. Again, Saw in Half is in a considerable amount of Magar of the Magic Strings deck. If that's the interaction you're looking for, it does not work. You probably might want to take that card out of your deck. Maybe it's in there because it's from the same set and all that kind of stuff, whatever. Nevertheless, it probably is likely a useless card in your deck because you're in an instant and sorcery theme. You probably don't have a lot of creatures you want to be copying with your Saw in Half. So it likely is mostly a dead card in your deck. You should definitely be taking it out if you have a Magar of the Magic Strings deck. But that is it. That is all. Again, just some, I guess it's more of a Magic rules video, but specifically certain cards that don't work with certain commanders. And again, I'm looking at EDH Rec. I'm looking at the actual statistics here, seeing how many of these cards are in these decks. And there's actually quite a few. And this is definitely something that I could continue doing. If you guys see any other interactions like this or people using cards incorrectly in certain decks, let me know in the comments below and I will cover it in another video. But that is it for today, and thanks for tuning in.